Okay.
All right. Thanks, guys, for coming and having this second discussion on miracles. I thought I'd just start by a sort of quick recap of the situation, and then I think the arguments will flow fairly quickly. So last time we talked, especially towards the end of the conversation, when sadly my internet ran out, but you two guys were able to reach an interesting point where you had established a kind of continuity between the emergence that we see in nature and the kinds of miracles that Christ was doing. And then John raised a good point of, but why do we need God then? Like, if we can explain miracles using, let's say, the emergence that we see within nature, then why do we need to bring something that is somehow beyond nature? And it's to try and address this that I wrote, actually the last two articles I wrote, but especially the last one. During the last discussion, John, you brought up the fact that historically, the need for something beyond nature in miracles showed up. You could see like the debate in the late Renaissance between some Neoplatonists and Christians and like Cartesians on the one side, and like this debate, I tried to look into it, but I didn't quite find something I could really sink my teeth into, because there was so much like political issues in between the metaphysical debates that it was hard for me to decipher. But over time, after looking into Christological issues, I found something where definitely we need to draw a line, where we definitely need to go beyond what we see within the naturalist worldview, at least typically, namely the incarnation. So I tried to therefore write something where I could stay as close as possible to the kinds of metaphysics that, John, you've been defending in this corner of the internet, while still, being able to make my way as close as possible to the incarnation and say clearly where we depart. So I can try to summarize this briefly. I know you've both read the article, so I won't try to go into tons and tons of details.
Excellent article. Excellent article.
Thank you. That means a lot. And yeah, I'll try to just summarize, and then you can both respond. So the basic idea was at the ground of really. There is possibility at the ground of being that gets shaped by the ground of intelligibility. There are constraints on nature. And we see these constraints at different layers. Like there are constraints in the basic laws of physics that constrain the emergence of particles at the bottom of physics. For instance, there are other constraints that show up, let's say, at the level of our consciousness, which will shape the emergence from our neurons in our body in an environment. And then there are higher level constraints still, for instance, the kinds of social level constraints that we mentioned last time when we talked about the placebo effect, for instance, that will shape the emergence of healings and other things. And I tried to use this basic idea that there's a logos, there's a ground of intelligibility that shaped things, and try to get it as close as possible to where I could with the incarnation. So I start with the logos at the bottom of things, and then I try to explain how the logos can act through human intellect. And that's kind of an old Platonic idea where, let's say, if I'm, in the example, I use the example of an engineer doing mathematics. If you're
I just want to interject to let people know that within mathematics, Platonism is a respected, even a prominent position. So you're not shuffling in something from the bottom of the deck here in any way, just to strengthen your argument, actually.
Thank you. Yeah. And because it works, because in mathematics, the truths we're dealing with are so abstract. Let's say if you take the Pythagorean theorem or any other kind of mathematical truth, you end up with something that would be true even if time and space themselves didn't exist. You're dealing with some very, very abstract level of reality, and humans can mediate between that abstract layer of reality and concrete reality. If I'm an engineer and I do mathematics and I use this very abstract relationship to create something, then this very abstract mathematical relationship will end up shaping the world through me. So you can see this as the logos, the ground of intelligibility, acting through human intellects to shape reality. It's the old biblical idea of Adam mediating between heaven and earth. Okay, so that's where I go to then, and then the step I try to make, which goes further, is to say how the incarnation goes further than this typical case of humans mediating between heaven and earth, where I want that in the case of the incarnation, rather than having, let's say, just sporadic actions of the logos through human intellects that happen here and there when we engage in like this or that activity, that in the case of the human nature of Christ, you see a hypostatic union, to use the precise term. You see a union in one person where the logos is constantly acting through, like irreducibly, the human nature of Jesus. And then you get this picture where throughout all of the development of nature, and I use Bergson there and his idea of how it is that you can see in evolution the apparition of more and more free kinds of life, like life forms that are able to be shaped, let's say, more and more abstractly by the logos. So
they have more
like,
possibilities open to them.
yes. Yes.
Maybe that's a better way of putting it, because it's more consistent with the premises of your previous argument. If you'll just allow me to interject there.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to help you out. I'm just trying to help you out right now.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you. That's how I wrote it in the article. It didn't come back to me quickly enough, but yes, that's right. So we have, let's say, humans, we have a lot more possibility than animals, and animals have still more possibility than plants, which have still more possibilities than minerals, for instance. But it's this fact that we humans have more possibility, which means that like the logos can shape, let's say, the bottom layer of physics, like can shape the ground can shape the possibility of the ground of being, the logos can then shape possibility through human intellect. And I want to say that then what happens, what is different from what we see in nature, like currently we don't see humans that are getting shaped like every instant by the logos directly. We see people who have like glimpses, but the claim for the incarnation would be, okay, at this point we have something different where the human nature always offers its potential to be shaped by the logos directly. And you have this cooperation then where the logos is always acting through the human nature of Jesus. So that's where I read a fair amount of Christology to try and make sure that I wouldn't say any heresy there. But I think that, so on the one end, I'm sort of trying to stretch what I can say from within your language, John. And on the other end,
I really respect and appreciate that. I just want to do something else to help you out, just for viewers. When JP is using the term intellect, he's not using it the way we currently use it today, as we would when we're talking about an intellectual. He's using it in more of the ancient Neoplatonic Greek sense, which is our capacity to grasp, abstract and profound patterns. And so it's not the same. It overlaps, but we shouldn't hear just that sense of intellect that we use in the world today. So, for example, and JP mentions this in his article, an artist who renders some beautiful music or some great work of art is also demonstrating nous, is also demonstrating intellect in that sense. And so the Platonic sense of intellect is much broader than our current sense. And so I want to emphasize that, because what JP is saying here isn't sort of, I don't want it to be thought of it as just sort of a purely conceptual thing that's happening. Some of his examples, like the mathematician, and JP, I believe, does that for good reason, because, as I said, Platonism within math is a well-respected position within mathematics. But if we go back to the original meaning, it is much more comprehensive of our humanity than our current word intellect would indicate. And I think that's also needed to, just again, to strengthen the argument you're making, JP. So I just wanted to put that in there.
Yes, thank you. And then what I'm ultimately trying to do with this is sort of a top-down move, where I'm trying to do metaphysics and to see how I can bring in the logos through human intellect. And then on the other end, I would sort of try to plug this in with what we discussed last time, especially, as I said earlier, the point where you two guys got to when I lost my internet connection, where we want to say that on the one end, the miracles, like the events that happen within Christ's lives, are within Christ's life, are events which are higher levels of emergence from what we see in nature. They're kind of weird events that explain the multiplicity of weird events that we see within nature. So I sort of try to get this bottom-up move from like emergence up until like the human nature of Christ, but I also try to get the top-down move from the logos through that human nature of Christ. So hopefully I get to like say, okay, this is the point where I have to break from the kind of naturalism that I think, John, you would be comfortable with, but like at least now it's clear. So that's my basic idea.
And you tried to argue. I mean, you acknowledged that, and again, thank you for that. That was charitable on your part. And I want to say, for anybody who reads the articles. I put a comment in when JP says John would agree with this, John would agree. He's right. He's getting it correct. And so he's not misrepresenting me in any way. But then you said, the argument sort of stops here, but you at least want to propose something that's in continuity. And I really liked the metaphor. I want to explore it with you. Of, differences of degree become differences in kind. We talked about that last time. And then this idea of a new kind of life, right? Almost the way, we have, intelligent life emerging out of non-intelligent life. You're proposing something at least analogous to that. Am I understanding you correctly?
Yes, that's correct. Yes.
Okay, and that topic, and again, I see, and the move you made at the end there, just to strengthen. I mean, you argued last time that at the core of C.S. Lewis's argument, right, is that the incarnation is the greatest miracle that makes the other miracles possible, and therefore, I think zeroing in on the incarnation here was actually, a completely legitimate move. So right now, I just want to make sure that I'm fully appreciating your argument and seeing it in the strongest possible fashion.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if you guys want to respond right away. I know you also mentioned Nishitani in your comment, John, and I ended up reading the book after your comment because it has really piqued my interest. And
which one? Religion and Nothingness?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Well, I do have some things to say on the basis of that. But I mean, I kind of want to hear Paul's initial reactions first, right? Just like you allowed me the chance to say how I was receiving it, I'd like to hear how Paul is receiving it before I respond, because I want this to be as inclusive as possible.
I don't mind just watching too, but I loved the paper. I thought it was a couple moments, my Protestant formation got tweaked a little bit, but I think I really loved the previous conversation we had, and I thought it took some surprising and delightful turns. I'm sorry, JP, that you lost your internet connection, but the end of the conversation was quite interesting. Lewis, when I look at how you mapped it out, I really love the way you mapped it out, and I think it's exactly right that you focused on the incarnation, because Lewis in Miracles very much sees, so nature is our sister. God is not within the system of nature. God, of course, is the source and the author of nature, and humanity is a sibling to nature, but also, we are the stuff of earth and the breath of God. So humanity is sort of this weird amphibian creature that is not fully natural, and we continue to bear witness to this position whenever we use words like human, man-made climate change, as if that is unnatural. I mean, and that's a persistent relic of our language that we have. And it's interesting then how the logos comes in terms of a mission, in order to, because the idea is that humanity rebelled, and so lost its comfortable relationship with its sister nature, and lost its communion with its source for at least half of its being. So in that way, for Lewis, human beings are also sort of a union between nature and God in his book Miracles. And so I thought the way you laid things out was very fair to Lewis's book. And I think it anticipates then what we talk about in terms of miracles here, that there is somehow with the, how to phrase this, with the power of the author, nature is capable of things that the sister alone is incapable of. And I thought you really illustrated that beautifully in terms of math and the engineer, that what we find with human engineers is this capacity. Human engineers pull from nature a capacity to do things that we don't find naturally occurring. And so I thought your paper was dead on faithful to Lewis's work. And I found it very comfortable in terms of my own framing of the world, given the influence that Lewis has had on me.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes me want to bring out another point that I think I should have brought in my summary, namely that in the logos constraining possibility since like the Big Bang, basically, you see like the logos coming to greater and greater expression, where like, and you can see this in Nishitani as well, where
Yep.
like let's say, it's especially clear in humans, we can bring out more of the logos than animals or plants can, for instance. And the idea that, John, you brought up earlier as well, that I mentioned, that then what I would see the incarnation as is as the first fruits from the dead, a new kind of life, as you mentioned, where in the same way that the logos can come to greater expression in human beings than it can in other animals, then the idea is that after the logos has constrained the possibility, like since the beginning of time, for humans to appear, and even within Israel, like you can see all of the weird constraints that Israel has had to become like this pure vessel of possibility for God to act. You get like this constant act of the logos at the grandest scale, until the logos can then have a vessel of possibility to act like at the scale of just one person, to bring in a new kind of life which would then happen. So I'm trying to bring in like both aspects of what John, you mentioned earlier, and what Paul, you just brought up, like this author writing himself into the story, like of the logos coming to greater expression, until you get to Christ, where you have a new kind of expression of the logos, which like the claim is that this will spread. So yeah, thank you.
So, I mean, thank you for reading the Nishitani. I think that's one of the top 5 most profound books I've read in my life. I've read it twice, and I plan to read it again. And I think the Kyoto School is really, I mean, the Kyoto School should be more in all of these discussions, because that is the school that is bridging between Eastern and Western philosophy, but directly, you know, pointed at the meaning crisis. Religion and Nothingness is about the meaning crisis, nihilism. Nishitani's book, The Self-Overcoming of Nihilism, is at, you know, so Nishitani has had a profound impact on me. So first of all, so I thank you for doing that. Paul, I'll try not to speak at a disadvantage to you, because I don't know if you've read it, but JP and I have, but we'll try and keep it as, yeah, I recommend it. It's a masterpiece, and it's generally regarded as such. I think deservedly so. So we'll try to be as explanatory as I can if I invoke it. I don't want to leave you out. Before I said we're amphibians, I always carry around my frog. So I carry around my frog because the idea that we're amphibians is actually directly from the Neoplatonic tradition. So the frog is my Neoplatonic tradition, and my rock is the Zen, and then the Kyoto School, of course, is the bringing of the two together. So I'm always carrying them around to remind me. So a couple things. First of all, one more note of appreciation, and I'd like to do a little bit of advertising about it. And this has to do with something, you know, that Greg Enriquez and I are going to be releasing on his podcast. We're trying to make a case for naturalism as something. And so if I can have just 2 minutes on that.
Yep.
The idea is, I make the claim that almost nobody's a materialist anymore, because people we think that everything's made out of matter. That's rather kind of that's basically a 17th century ontology. There's all kinds of things. There's fields, there's forces, there's causation, there's temporal relations, there's the curvature of space, there's the continuum, there's potentially multiple universes, blah, 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 blah. So technically, I would say most people are physicalists, and then there's variations of physicalists. There are reductive physicalists who say everything can be replaced ultimately by the language of physicalism. And then there are non-reductive materialists who say, no, there are things that can't be reduced. They will never be inconsistent with the physics, but they are non-reducible to it. And this has to do with a lot of the stuff we've been talking about, real emergence, the fact that the level at which people are doing science has to really exist, or the science doesn't really exist, and then the science can't tell us that everything is reducible to the bottom layer, right? You've heard me make these arguments, so that I'm a non-reductive physicalist, not any kind of materialist or reductive physicalist. This is a position, by the way, I'm not some weird, freaky fringe person in the scientific community. I think I'm fairly mainstream. And so, and I get it that you guys want to still, I'm trying to say thank you, so just hang on, that you still want to criticize the sufficiency claims of naturalism. But I want to thank you for making it clear that naturalism, non-reductive physicalism, right, is not materialism. And it shouldn't be criticized or straw-manned as some kind of materialism. That's unfair. That's unfair. And so I wanted to, I mean, JP, you were meticulously careful about that. And I wanted to acknowledge and thank you for that. I think that, and even your there's a sense of trying to say, like, I can come up with an account that might be consistent, although not reducible. That's also in the spirit of what we're talking about here. So I wanted to say thank you. I brought up Nishitani because and I thought this might engender some deepening of the discussion, and then I'll make that point, and perhaps we can open things up a little bit. So Nishitani, of course, is coming out of a Zen Buddhist tradition, and his definition of religion, I think, is really apropos here. He calls it the real self-realization of reality, which is this fundamental, and I want to be really clear. You know how I use realization in the double sense? I got it from Nishitani. He's explicitly using realization in that double sense, the real self-realization of reality. And the reason I brought that up is that sounded very much like what, and JP's nodding, so at least my intuition was at least prima facie correct, very much what JP was talking about, that right there, right, that in human beings we see the possibility of what, you know, the logos coming to this greater and greater self-realization. It's much more implicit in inanimate things, more explicated, and this is Aristotle and Plotinus, right? Much more explicated in animals, and so on and so forth. Now, the reason why I brought it up, and so here's the point of challenge. So I've tried to be really friendly about this because I really appreciate what you've done, and I want to respond in kind, right?
Thank you.
Is that Nishitani is offering that, and he defines it as religion, so he makes it very clear, and it's the kind of religious state, if I can put it that way, using his language, now that I've given his definition, that is the response to the threat of nihilism, hence the book, Religion and Nothingness. When we get to the real self-realization of reality, we can take the no-thingness that has a purely negative sense in nihilism, and it is inverted, it is aspect changed to be the most profound positive thing that we can experience. It becomes the field, and right. So, and you guys are familiar with this from your own Christian tradition. The no-thingness of God is different from the no-thingness of evil, right? And what Nishitani is claiming, right? I was invoking Augustine there, right? What Nishitani is claiming is this state, right, of enlightenment is precisely the thing that brings about that shift in people's realization. And he argues that that is the fundamental response to nihilism. Is that fair?
Yep.
To your reading, JP, and Paul, does that sort of at least make a prima facie sense to you?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, and then I want to invoke one other thing, because I invoked Augustine. I'm trying to use the American pronunciation. You guys say Augustine. I was always taught Augustine, so I don't know what that's supposed to mean. But I want to point to something in the Confessions that is really interesting, and it's always intrigued me. And I take it that Augustine is, you know, especially for you, JP, but I think Paul, you've invoked him several times, and he's one of the masters of this whole discussion, the logos and all of this. And in the Confession, the thing that I want to point to is not his conversion, but the experience he had before his conversion.
Yeah.
Because he relates that he has a mystical experience, union with the One, but he can't maintain it. But he thinks it, in some sense, prepares him and opens him up to the possibility of conversion. So then, if I can say it in trying to use the Greek language, the Neoplatonic metanoia prepares him for the Christian metanoia. But I was always intrigued by the fact that, right, Augustine admits that he was able to achieve it temporarily. And JP points to that at least to in maybe something similar with the mathematician.
Yep.
Is that fair? Am I being
Yes, yes,
here? Okay.
yes.
All right. So I really, like I said, I'm deeply appreciative of the way I've been treated, and I want to respond deeply in kind. This is important to me. So let's say we've got somebody within the Orthodox Christian tradition who, and his thing is, well, I achieved it, but I couldn't maintain it. And then he has the whole original sin theory, the gravitas that pulls him down, right? But Nishitani belongs to a tradition that doesn't have that idea and has the idea of the Buddha, and not just the Buddha, multiple people who achieve what I would call enlightenment, and this does become their permanent and ongoing way of being. That's what they report, and that's what the tradition holds. And so what I, again, all right, is that this seems to be a state that, and you guys know that I try to give an account of enlightenment within Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, and that a naturalistic account. So isn't it, and of course, we also have within the Neoplatonic tradition, Porphyry reports that, Plotinus achieved union with the one, and he was able to do it multiple times, not quite continuous, but he was close to that, etc. Right? Is it not possibly the case that other individuals have achieved a continuity of the real self-realization of reality? And it's reported in these other traditions. I mean, I'm not like a card-carrying Buddhist or anything like that. You guys know that. But so what I'm bringing up is, I think you're right about differences of degree producing differences of kind, and I think the idea of enlightenment described as a new kind of life is beautifully accurate for how I see enlightenment. And don't forget, Plato's theory is a theory of enlightenment. You come out of the cave into the light, right? The Platonic and like even the Zen. And don't forget, the Kyoto school from Suzuki on saw deep resonance between the Zen account of enlightenment and the Platonic account. So I'm not doing something slippery here, right? That you get accounts of individuals who have achieved enlightenment. Yes. And I want to say, well, doesn't that hold out the possibility that this is a state that is, sorry for this part, you guys, this is the part that will be wincy, that is naturalistically realizable by human beings. The Buddha famously argued that no divine intervention was needed for enlightenment. The gods were irrelevant. That's what makes him, yes, there's gods in the Buddhist world, but what makes him a non-theist is exactly that claim, right? And he explicitly said he wasn't a god. He refused to perform miracles. He's kind of the opposite in some ways, right? So that's what I'm holding out as the challenge topic. And I hope it's taken in good spirit because I offered it in good faith. So,
yes. Do you want to respond first, Paul?
Sure.
Okay.
I guess I would, in some ways, I ask the question, what are we looking for? Mm-hmm. And, I've been ever since I stumbled into this weird world of Jordan Peterson and then this little corner of the internet. One of the things that I had never had to deal with on an ongoing basis in my ministry was the reality of psychedelics and people's I'll say people's exploration of reality with psychedelic drugs. And I had quite a bit more experience of working with people with street drugs. Let me offer this idea that in the Gospels, Jesus regularly goes to solitary places to pray. Mm-hmm. And he takes his disciples. His disciples don't seem particularly good at it because often the times he goes with them, they don't quite know what to do. They fall asleep, but that's sort of normal with this kind of thing. There is the one time when Jesus is transfigured and Jesus tells them to, well, let's just keep this between us, which, at least until after the events that Jesus anticipates. But the times that Jesus goes to the mountain and we assume experiences union with the Father, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. are for Jesus in continuation with miracles such as turning water to wine, multiplying loaves and fishes, raising the dead. And so I guess what I would offer is that whereas I don't feel a need to sort of demand exclusivity with respect to human experiences, because none of us can see from the inside what is going on with a Buddhist monk who is an expert at what they are doing in the temple, or any what we basically see on one level is a person, there's stories of levitation and stuff. We'll set that aside for now. But basically what we see if we go to someone practicing one variety of pursuit of the divine via an inside experience is a person sitting tranquilly and still for a while, and then they will come out and they will give a report of, to the degree that they can, of the ineffable, let's say. But one of the things that I think is central to Christianity with respect to the Gospels, and so often misunderstood, is that the miracles that Jesus does are intended to, in some ways, be taking what happens inside that personal connection with the divine and manifesting it in materiality. And so if you look at, say, Lewis's book on miracles, when you get to the end of the book, Lewis talks about miracles of the old creation and miracles of the new creation. And what I would say, Jesus, if I would continue on the line that Lewis sort of gives us indication of, what I would say Jesus does is what he does on the mountaintop when he, the gospel simply report he went to the mountain to pray. Okay, he doesn't come down and say, oh, this. The Apostle Paul gives some renderings of, some little clues about he was taken up to the third heaven, yada, yada, yada. But what happens in the miracles, in the multiplication of the loaves and fishes, in the water to wine, is that Jesus is saying, I am taking what has happened inside of me in my communion with the Father, and I am expressing it in the world with this miracle here and now. And sort of like the experience within, let's say, a meditative union with God, the multiplied loaves and fishes do decay. The wine is consumed. The dead that Jesus raises die again. The point of those miracles are in some ways analogous to the engineer and the bridge. And part of the reason I really liked JP's continuation is that the engineer and the bridge and the multiplication of loaves and fishes are also within a continuum of God reaching through us via logos and manifesting his work in the world.
Can I respond to that, JP, or do you want to respond to what I said, or how would you?
I think I can respond right now. It's I think it goes in the same area as Paul. So probably once you respond to, probably you can respond to both of us, John. Then
Okay, fair to me.
I think there's like differences in how we conceive of the logos or dharma, and how we also conceive of the experience of.
Thank you for doing that, by the way. Dharma and logos are very close translations of each other.
Thank you. I think in some translations of the Bible in India, that's the word they used for logos.
Exactly.
And so I think there's, like, in the same way that we will differ, John, I think, in how we conceive of the logos and how we share responsibility, we will also differ in how a human experiences union with the logos. And in the article, I don't know if you noticed, but I never talked about supernaturalism. I tried as much as possible within that article to see if I could even say something that would be compatible with non-reductive naturalism. I didn't just come out and say that, okay, well, John is a secret supernaturalist, and like within his ontology, I
Because
can
I'm
sort
not. So that was very, very accurate and kind of you at the same time.
of. But I suspect that there's like a deep. I think that let's say the kinds of supernaturalism that I see Aquinas defending or Church Fathers defending is much closer to the kind of non-theism that I see Nishitani defending as well. I think basically a lot of the worry that lots of people have against supernaturalism is almost the same as the worry that Thomists will have against like people denying divine simplicity. Like we don't want to say that the supernatural is some sort of parallel track to the universe. We want to say that it's the ultimate ground of everything, that is simple, immutable, and so on. And the way that the Logos will incarnate in Christ, for instance, isn't because like some event happened in the ground of being, like that the Logos changed or whatever. We want to say, at least in the classical tradition, that it's the relationship between some entity in the world and the Logos that appeared, and the Logos itself didn't change. So anyway, I do think that there will. I'm not sure exactly what the differences will be between, let's say, Aquinas' God and Nishitani's emptiness, but I don't think it's as far as, let's say, most people could surmise. Even I've heard David Bentley Hart mentioning that the kind of non-theism that we see in Buddhism, for instance, he sees it as an healthy rejection of many kinds of deism or bad theological attempts in Christianity. So
yeah, he's one of the few of the big popular names who talks about non-theism in a respectful and serious fashion, and you know, and his the experience of God, he actually uses the three characteristics drawn from Vedanta to try and like bliss and stuff like that to try and describe it. So he is somebody from the West who's, I think, sincerely reaching out to the East. If I can, I don't like that language, but we don't have other language right now. So yeah, I think that's right. So that's exactly why I recommended Nishitani, because I think there is, and you know, and like I said, you see from D.T. Suzuki on and in Nishitani, you see the people in the Kyoto school recognizing resonance with Neoplatonism. And I agree with John Caputo, you know, also a sort of I guess a post-Christian non-theistic theologian who's fairly significant right now, because he's one of the theologians, I think, who's wrestled with postmodernism like very successfully and come out with something very powerful. Him and Mark Taylor, I think, are the two premier examples. So just to advertise for their important work, because Caputo says that basically the attraction, you know, the Kyoto school is attracted to Heidegger because of the mystical element in Heidegger's thought, which is from Eckhart. And of course, we know that Eckhart is coming out of the Neoplatonic tradition within Christianity. So they keep recognizing each other and calling to each other across very significant divides. And I want to point out that that's something really important we should pay attention to.
Yeah.
So maybe we can that can be fertile ground.
Can I? There was a second step to my response that ties in.
Sorry. I'm sorry.
Okay. Oh, it's good. I just don't want to lose track, because I was trying to tie it in with what Paul said as well.
Please.
Because in the same way that we will have some disagreements about the Logos itself. I'm not sure exactly how those will play out in practice, but I think those map down also to how we see the Logos incarnate. And there was a place in Nishitani's book, Religion and Nothing. I even remember it's on page 201. He mentions that. But I mean, I read it like over the last week, so it's fresh. He mentions that. Okay, so the role of people who achieve enlightenment is to like induce enlightenment in others as well. But the fact is, we live in a history where most people are not in a state of enlightenment. And you mentioned that there hasn't been much thought within Buddhism about like how let's say history, like how you can see the unfoldment of Logos in history and how enlightenment is supposed to spread in history.
That's right.
And he even mentions that he would have expected it to come up in Mahayana Buddhism, where there's like this great idea that comes close to Christianity, where people take a vow when they like
Bodhisattvas,
the Bodhisattva, they take up a vow that they will not enter into nirvana until they have brought all beings into
Enlightenment.
nirvana themselves. So like they just keep reincarnating and until they can bring everyone to nirvana, to enlightenment. And that's that. At this point, you start getting close to the idea that within Christianity, the way that we conceive of the logos, even though the logos remains immutable, doesn't change, even though emptiness remains the same, we want to say that there's like the ways that Dharma is constituted, or the ways that the logos is constituted, will reach towards greater and greater incarnation of the logos of the Dharma. It's kind of really an incarnation, is sort of coming down into potentiality to bring something down. So what like the movement that I see within Mahayana Buddhism towards like this drive to sort of come back down to spread enlightenment is like reaching towards what I see in Christianity, where the logos also comes down to spread the new kind of life that we see in Christ. But so I see those kinds of two things, where in the same way that Paul was talking about the experience of Jesus on the mountain coming down to bring something down, to bring patterns into like incarnation. I would argue, but it's all, I don't have like clear-cut arguments. It's part of why I like to have this conversation. Like I see that there's like something different about the way that the logos incarnates within Christianity that I don't see like exactly in how the logos incarnates in Buddhism.
Sure, but that's a symmetrical argument, of course.
Yes, that's true. That's true.
Right. So it's like
Yep.
difference is a symmetrical property. I'm glad you see, though, that there's at least sort of approximations or relevant similarities, because one of the things that you get in the Nishitani book, and I think this needs to be said about Erigena too, is like, and I've kept trying to emphasize this, to replace the hierarchical model, right, with the complete interpenetration of emergence and emanation. There's no emanation without emergence. There's no emergence without emanation. They're completely interpenetrating. And to use your language, if it's not trespassing, the complete and utter identity between God's transcendence and his immanence. That if you keep them as radically opposite and not fundamentally ontologically identical, you're actually dividing God in a way that trespasses on the unity of God, I think. That was Erigena's argument, at least, as far as I could see it. And so it seems to me that if that's the case, what we're talking about isn't, I want to be really careful here, isn't like an ontological case of something incarnating, but more, as you said, at a level, there's levels of realization, and a particular level is available. And this is why I like the new life. There's a particular level. Yep. And any being at that level will have that kind of life, have that kind of realization. And so that's kind of what I'm arguing for. Now, I want to respond to Paul, and that I think that's like the point about so one of the things that's always intrigued me, and I'm glad we're in a good faith discussion because I can talk to you guys about this without, right, is the opposite attitudes towards miracles in the two traditions. There's indications that the Buddha was capable of some miracles, but he steadfastly refused to perform miracles. In fact, he said, "This is how you will know somebody's not one of my disciples, if they offer to perform a miracle." And I don't know if I've ever related how the Buddha with the woman who lost her child.
No.
Okay, because I want to tell this story because it's a way in which the Enlightenment comes into materiality in a really palpable way. So if you give me a moment, you know, and you guys got tons of parables, so right. So a woman comes to the Buddha and she says, you know, her son has died and she wants him to raise him from the dead. Now, nobody thinks this is a ridiculous request, by the way. Okay. So she says, will you raise him from the dead? Will you raise him from, and he, no, go away. And she keeps coming. And then he right. Very much like Jesus with the woman at the well, right? Okay, he says, I'll raise your son from the dead, but you have to do one thing for me. And she says, what? She says, and by the way, it's a mustard seed again, which is really kind of weird. She says, you have to go into town and you have to get a mustard seed from somebody's house. And she says, oh, sure, great. And he's, oh no, one condition. You have to get a mustard seed from a house that has not tasted the grief of death. And she, oh, of course. And she goes in and she knocks on the door and she, do you have mustard seed? Yes. Has anybody suffered grief from? Oh, yes. And she goes from house to house to house to house. And now think about the mathematician having the insight.
Yep.
And then she goes, oh, right. And she goes back to the Buddha and she says, thank you. And that was the response to grief, right? And she gets a kind of insight. Now, to me, Paul, that sounds like a very powerful, materialization, if we'll use that word, right, of enlightenment into the healing of a woman who is experiencing one of the most profound, negative experiences that human being, and he's transforming it into what grief can do for human beings, which is make them human in a way. Like one of the wisest persons in my life said to me, don't get deeply involved with somebody who hasn't tasted grief because they haven't reached the depths of their humanity. And that was like, oh, right. And that's what he's doing. So like I see, I'm offering, I'm saying that's not the same thing as a miracle, but it's like, it seems to be a materialization that is of considerable value. So that was offering as a response.
When I think about, there's obviously the wisdom of that story is profound.
Yes. Yeah.
And, but when I ask myself, I know very little. I should read Nishitani's book because I really am not conversant at all in
I'm sorry
in
for
Eastern.
putting you at a
I mean,
disadvantage.
I've spent my whole life, where I am and doing what I am. But so going back to Lewis and his book, I mean, part of what Lewis offers in that book for me, and part of why the book was so helpful, was it does connect what in at least my formation within the Christianity available to me when and where I grew up was sort of a disconnected world. And the stories of Jesus are these are these very sometimes strange. It's certainly not a fairy tale. Well, I shouldn't say that either, but it's certainly not mere wish fulfillment.
No, I get what you meant. Yeah. Go ahead.
But yet it is the I guess maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm not doing anything more than reiterating my point that in some ways the experience of union that we can have to whatever degree we do, and I think those degrees scale too. I mean, not too far from from where I live is Yosemite National Park. And if you go down there during the summer, you find the valley floor is just swamped with tourists from all over the world to look at rock. I mean, that's what they look at. They look at rock. But when you go to Yosemite Valley and you walk in that valley and you see El Capitan and you see Half Dome and, many other features, you say, I mean, people go there because there's a lift, there's a something happens at a very small level, but enough to have people travel from all over the world, Asia, Europe, all to come to Yosemite Valley. I think part of what Christianity offers is the realization that the good materiality of this world can somehow be joined with its author in a way that is not simply psychological. And that in fact, so Lewis's central chapter in in the book Miracles is the grand miracle, where of course the incarnation comes and he dives all the way to the depths and he pulls the rest up with him and into a, and of course in Christianity, the result of all of this is a new creation. And of course, within the Christian tradition, there's a lot of trying to get at, okay, what on earth are we talking about with this? So of course, with Dante, you've got the beatific vision, and so that has been an attempt. But in the ends, at the end of the book of Revelation, for example, there's this new creation, and this of course is also seen in the book of Isaiah, where maybe for now the devoted, disciplined, practiced holy man can discover wisdom and beauty and in a sense an escape from death and a taste of eternity, which is, as Augustine, difficult to maintain for very long. I think inherent in Christianity and manifest by the miracles is the idea that materiality itself will participate in what right now only we, these strange amphibians, can touch on for only certain sacred moments.
Mm.
And I think that is, in fact, the gospel. And there's lots of questions all the way on down about that. And this is why I think in the Christian tradition, right now, for example, in the midst of a pandemic, when in church we thank God for, of course, this will be controversial with everything's controversial. I just had my second Pfizer shot in my arm this morning, but
okay, which I'm glad.
Yeah. So the scientists, that entire civilization machinery that has led to an mRNA vaccine in my arm to combat this virus. This is all the work of the Spirit of God. And this is a part of this grand movement that God has undertaken, exemplified in the incarnation, which is moving us towards final union, which now maybe we only experience at the limits of our capacity, but by virtue of a vaccine, by sanitation, by irrigation, by all of the stuff that is happening in technology, that is happening in culture, that is happening in art. All of this is moving us towards some final reunion with and with what we were made for. And so, and I think the critique of miracles that I hear in your story, I don't find alien at all in Christianity, because Jesus was very critical of the crowds who were looking for him for easy solutions, easy answers, a display and a show. And he would often say, you ask a perverse generation asks for a sign, I'll give you the sign of Jonah. And then he says, Jonah spent 3 days in the belly of the fish. And everybody probably listened to him and thought, are we going to take a trip to the sea? And of course, he was speaking about resurrection. But I think the entire flow of this in Christianity is not, I think it's intelligible and understandable. And I think part of the reason, there's a lot of ways that we went wrong, but I'll leave it right there. I hope that is intelligible, because I actually don't think many people understand that this is what Christianity is really about. But I think it is. That's how I understand what I understand Christianity to be about.
Paul, can I just ask an understanding question? It's not
Sure.
a challenge. So what I'm hearing you say, and again, not a challenge, I want to make sure I'm understanding you, that what Christianity is saying is something like all of nature could be brought to this higher level of realization.
Yes.
Am I understanding you correctly?
Yes.
And that's the central point of the miraculous element in Christianity, is to point to that redemption of the world, if to use more sort of religious language. Have I
Yes.
understood you
Yes.
correctly? Okay.
And that's Lewis's contention in the book too.
Right. Okay. I'll let JP respond. I just want to make sure I understood you correctly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we see that in the Origina too, right? Of how all of nature is meant to, like all of, yeah, nature. Origina uses nature in a term that's like different from what we're using right now. But let's say all of material reality is supposed to also come back to the creator through humans, ultimately. But yeah, as far as the response, it seems, I suspect we reach a point where it gets difficult to get deeper at the issue metaphysically, and Paul in large part was speaking existentially, and I think this is kind of what we have to do, like as far as choosing what does the incarnation of the, like what do we choose, how do we choose to conceive of the logos and its incarnation. In the article, I was in large part trying to show that it's at least intelligible to speak of the incarnation, even if like we can, even though a naturalist would likely want to disagree at some parts, I wanted to make the claim that it's intelligible. And I really like the way that you two just put it in terms of how it's not just humans that get to participate in the logos, but like all of creation is meant to participate in the logos through humans. And earlier, Paul, you also talked about your experience like living with people and being able to offer them this experience. And I don't know a lot about Buddhism. I mean, I read Nishitani's book, and I just watched a few like lectures and videos online to get an idea. But the way also that to bring it back almost to the point I said earlier about history, the way that enlightenment is spread is different. I've heard, and you please correct me, John, if I'm wrong, but I've heard that in practice, in many places where Buddhism is more spread, like the practices that the monks will do are very different from the practices that the lay people will do. I mean, with, let's say,
But that's the same in Christianity too, to be
yeah,
fair.
yeah, that's true. But I mean,
Right.
like
I think
for
that's
instance,
more of a sociological fact than something that goes to the heart of the religions. So
yeah, I think that's true. You can see the parallel phenomenon where there is kind of an idea that the monks will reach enlightenment through meditation and practice and so on, and the lay people are doing other kinds of practices that will prepare them in a future life where they will be monks, and then they will achieve enlightenment. Does that sound fair, or like am I getting a wrong sample?
yeah, a little bit. The Mahayana, is there's many, and there's many strands of Buddhism, like there are many strands of Christianity.
Yeah.
So I guess what I would say is, well, let me do another story from the Buddha, because
Yep.
I want to try and then let me try and be clear about what's being claimed, and then I want to try and respond to Paul's point, because I think Paul made an excellent point. And I think, JP, I think the point you made, and I think you're trying to get back to, is there's a commitment, just like Paul said, there's a commitment to the materiality of the world. I think your point is, in Christianity, there's a commitment to history that's important.
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
The logos will manifest through history.
Yeah. And I'm trying to, and that what you're saying is, in Christianity, these are brought together in a powerful way. So first of all, I want to emphasize that we talked about the amphibious, right? The Neoplatonic tradition. I carry the frog around, and that's because the frog has is a different kind of organism, a different kind of life. And so the Neoplatonists thought they could achieve a new kind of life, not just a momentary thing. And the same thing with the Buddha. And this is the story of how he got his title. So he sits under the Bodhi tree. He achieves enlightenment. He's walking down the street, and he's met by people. And I think I put this in the series, but I'll just remind you of it. And they're just sort of like impressed by his countenance. It's shining, right? Phenomenon, right? And they say to him, "Are you a god?" And he says, "No." And they say, "Well, are you a heavenly messenger?" "No." "Are you a prophet?" "No." And then they're frustrated, and they say, "Are you just a man?" And he goes, "No." Which, in that last answer, is important. And they say, "Well, what are you then?" And he says, "I am awake." See, so he's not trying to talk about a momentary. He's talking about, right, an ontological change. So I wanted to say, Buddhism isn't making a psychological claim; it's making an ontological claim. And again, I think the Neoplatonists are too. That's why the frog, right? The symbolism is clear. So now I want to put that out because I think I want to sort of push back on what it's just a psychological thing. I don't think that's fair. I think it's existential, ontological. Now I do want to come back to the points that I think are really good points that you guys are making, which is the redemption of history and the redemption of the material world, and that something is being pointed to with them. If I can put it this way, there's something being pointed to in the incarnation above enlightenment. That is a way of talking about the redemption of history. And of course, JP, you connect that to the history of Israel, and Paul, the redemption of the materiality of the world. And so if I, because I think those are good points. I just, sorry, I didn't mean your previous point, Paul, about psychology wasn't a good point, but I think it can be responded to. But these 2 points I think are excellent. Because, you know, I've always, and I hope this isn't insulting, because from my point of view, it's honoring. I've always conceived of Jesus as an enlightened being, right? I've conceived of other people as enlightened, Socrates, and you know, and the Buddha, and right, these figures that seem to be able to cause titanic, seismic shifts in history and culture, and those 3 figures clearly have that. And that to me is evidence of something being at work in them, different than the momentary experiences of Augustine or you and I, right? And Paul, you've made arguments similar about this. You know, it's the world-changing aspect of Christianity that points to something deeper. And I think by fairness, we can say, well, there's world-changing aspects in the Buddha, there's world-changing aspects in Socrates, so we should take that as evidence for something deeper than a momentary state. I think that's a fair argument on my part to make.
Yes.
Right. So what I hear is, and you guys are acknowledging that, and thank you, I appreciate that, that's good. And so what you're saying is, well, you're not saying this, but I'm saying it and trying to play in your ballpark. You know, Jesus is enlightened like these other figures, but there's something more about history and materiality that we don't see in the other Enlightenment figures. I think that's a very good point. I think those are very good points. And maybe part of what is meant by incarnation above and beyond enlightenment is exactly those 2 points. Jesus isn't just enlightened, let's say he is, right? But there's also, that enlightenment is also redeeming points to the possible redemption of the material world and history, right? I hadn't thought of that. I'm just like grokking it for those of you who know Heinlein, right? I think that's a very good point. Now, I guess and JP already acknowledges this, so maybe we're getting to this point. I don't think those 2 points can be established argumentatively. I mean, they're promises, right? They're promises. And so what you can say, perhaps, I hesitate to put words in your mouth, but you can say something like, maybe we can get to this, you know, enlightenment, and we can get, and that closes the gap between naturalism and what you guys are talking about considerably. But then there's still, the gap is open, because the incarnation carries within it 2 promises that are not promised by these other examples of enlightenment. And that can't be reached by naturalistic argument, but nevertheless, we've closed the gap considerably. Does that feel fair to you two?
Oh yeah.
Yes.
Oh yes. And I think the gap, you know, gaps are funny things. You look at a spark plug, for example. The gap is really important because the gap sort of allows a connection that at closing would not allow.
Yep.
And you know, I want to on part of JP's point, you know, I'm often critiquing or even sometimes criticizing the Protestant tradition, even though I am a Protestant, so I'm allowed to do so.
And it's honorable of you to do so, by the way.
But one of the things that, and I won't say that the Roman Catholic tradition didn't do this, but I know that the reformers emphasized it. So part of what Luther pointed to, and very much the Swiss Reformation, which was Zwingli and Calvin and others, was that the not everyone will get to be someone who will go into a cloister or a monastery and have powerful world transforming visions, but that the mason and the farmer and the mother and the daughter and the son and even the cow and the squirrel do in their way do the work of participation in this reunion with the divine. And that is, that was a profound point made by Luther. And again, like with all of these things, there's back and forth in it. But and so, for example, when in the, what the Swiss reformers have been doing, some reading from the Reformation period lately, part of what the Swiss reformers wanted to do was the city, and of course they're following Augustine here, they want to manifest the city of God in our midst. And that also was a participation in this movement. And again, I mean, these arguments in terms of comparing East and West are always fraught, because they're probably far more complex than any of us have the data to really intelligibly make. But the fact that science arose as it did in the West, I think also speaks to this, because there was a theological disposition towards manifesting, Christianity talks about it a lot of different ways, the kingdom of God or the will of God, manifesting this in stone and wood. And of course, you see some of that with the East, with, Feng Shui and Zen, and, all of those things, but manifesting it. And that this was not, technology was not anathema to this process. In fact, technology was a part of this process, in that the development of technology was itself part of the religious quest, as much as the devoted monk to their prayers or meditation in the monastery. And I think that is, what's so interesting to me. So this week, part of what's been delightful about my few years on YouTube now is, on one hand, I'm always got the meanderings of my mind in the conversation. I also have the discipline of the preaching schedule. And so this week I am preaching out of the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus comes into a locked room and he shows them the scars. But, after these post-resurrection appearances, they always have difficulty recognizing him. He says, "It is I myself. It is I myself." And so as I'm meditating on the sermon that I'll preach this Sunday, I'm thinking about, okay, what, the book of Colossians, the Jesus that they knew was sort of creation 1.0. Now the resurrected Jesus is sort of creation 2.0. And there's continuity in the scars, which is such an interesting thing to find continuity in, especially because, the violence within the story is, it's an attempt to kill God. I mean, it's all the way back to Genesis 3 in a sense, in a magnified sense. Yet at the same time, it's in that he says, "It is I myself." And then, of course, in the Christian story, Jesus, spends a few weeks popping in on people, and then he ascends. So they all get the story. Okay, he's going to the control room of earth, which is, and Lewis goes into that in his book Miracles. But then the point of that is that something of him himself with the scars gets into all of his followers via the Holy Spirit. And they are the ones, now again, back to the Reformation, they are the ones learning to farm better, learning to mother better and care for the home and develop technology. And so, and even those who would never enter a monastery still participate in this. as in the development of a vaccine. And so again, to me, that's Christianity.
I'd like to just add one thing on that front, Paul. This is the fact that, okay, if you have within Christianity the fact that the Logos manifested itself through this incarnation that culminated in the self-sacrifice of the incarnate Logos, it gives something very concrete to unfold the Logos in history for everyone. Like, it's readily accessible. I know tons of people, for instance, who get a spiritual experience at some time during liturgy by contemplating this self-sacrifice of the Logos. And then this makes them, even though like they don't need like any sophisticated theology or knowledge. I know plenty of like simple people who won't never spend time in a monastery who still get the spiritual experience, and which they will then unfold in their lives by doing their own self-sacrifice on behalf of people around them. So like this redeeming of history that happens within the incarnation, this redeeming of matter can apply to even very simple people who won't, let's engage in the same discipline of spiritual exercises that monks will, for instance.
So I want to try and pick up on this. Some very powerful things. First of all, I had an insight. Sorry, that sounds pretentious, but I had a realization why the topic of teleology keeps coming up. And you know that I'm getting into discussions with people about it. Perhaps this is a suggestion. Is this discussion of teleology an attempt to see the unfolding of the redemption of materiality and history at work? I mean, is there a connection there, right? Is this what people are doing? Like, I'm asking an open question here. Are they saying, okay, what's like, I'm not saying they're doing necessarily this explicit self-dialogue, but I'm speaking on their behalf, right? So what's unique, you know, it's the redemption of history, the redemption of materiality, and therefore I should see signs of that. You know, teleology should be present in matter. I'm thinking of the discussion I had with Sam, and it should be present, right, it should be present in history. There should be a telos in matter and a telos in history. Do you think that's a fair connection I just made? Do you think that that's why?
Yeah.
So the discussion of teleology is perhaps the place where this comes out argumentatively, if I could put it that way. Now, about the self-sacrifice, again, I mean, in terms of historicity, you know, other people have made this. This is not unique to me. You know, there's a lot of motifs in Christ's death, his trial and death, that are borrowed from Socrates, right? That was prepared. So it's definitely right. That it's definitely that motif. Like, you know, the person who right who dies willingly in order to, you know, manifest truths that cannot be manifest by living. I mean, that's many people, you know, Socrates basically demonstrates the unexamined life is not worth living. And the only way he can actually demonstrate that in a way that would be transformative of other people is if he dies, right? If people are forcing him into the choice, the unexamined life or death, he chooses death, and he does it voluntarily because he could have fled, and he does it in order to really make clear, right, the truth of that claim that the unexamined life is not worth living. And I think that, again, I think that's reachable to, I mean, it still reaches across the centuries. It had a profound impact on me. Are you guys both here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I hope so. Oh,
yeah.
Now you froze.
Yeah.
Okay, you're back.
Back to normal.
What did you hear? How far did it get?
Reaches across the centuries. Are you guys still
okay,
here?
good, because that's when I stopped talking. That's when I stopped talking. Was perfect. Maybe a pregnant pause there.
Well, and you're, you know, so I was listening to I was doing a little work in Rene Girard this morning too, and I would say that motif and the Gospels. I mean, the Jesus story is amazing because on one hand it is self-sacrifice, and on the other hand he's a victim. I mean, both of those things come together, and you know, potentially there could be, you know, some of that in Socrates as well. But you know, this sort of gets into sort of, you know, Jordan Peterson land, because you have these questions about, you know, in terms of the you know, if there's physics in the world with respect to gravity and, you know, all of this stuff, is there also sort of relational physics out there that this willing sacrifice and the power it unleashes in terms of, you know, how we are relationally, you know, profoundly has echoes through the world. And so, you know, again, while in my sermons, a lot of people will say things to me like, not a lot of people, but I hear it at least anyway. They'll say, okay, pastor, I'll grant you, because everybody wants to look at the first, Lewis makes this point in Miracles as well, the first 5 minutes after the resurrection. Well, I don't know if a dead person can come back to life, blah, 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 blah. But every now and then someone will say, okay, I'll grant you the walking out of the tomb, talking to his buds, shooting up to heaven. So what? So what? And I think, you know, so if we would ask the question, okay, if Socrates after 3 days would come out of his tomb, what would he do?
That's wonderful, Paul. That's very good. My laugh is not a ridicule.
No, I know,
That's
I understand.
Very good.
Because I've been playing this with society, because Jesus does things that I would expect him to go up to Herod and Pilate and say, hey, ha, 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 ha. He doesn't do any of that. I don't think Socrates would either, but the question of how is the future transformed? And for John, for your project, this is a very big question. Because when I look at your religion that isn't a religion, and I mean this in all good faith, you want to see your efforts now transform the world, and not just if the numbers of people, the numbers of people experiencing, mystical experiences. You want to see the meaning crisis addressed, and that is relationally. And it's, of course, there's physicality involved in it, because someone who has an awakened from the meaning crisis, and this, will be a better father and be a better partner and be a better citizen. And in fact, you want your efforts to materially go out into the world and, in Jewish language, bring shalom, so that, and of course, Socrates' death is the same, does the same thing.
Yeah, just one cool thing I'd like to add about Socrates is in several Eastern churches, you'll see some Greek philosophers painted, let's say, as icons on the outside, because we'll recognize that they were deeply influential on the tradition. And on the other side of the spectrum, in Catholic theology, especially in the last few decades, with the interactions with other religions, it has become fairly mainstream, let's say, to say that enlightenment happens through the logos, and let's say it happens one way within Christianity for people who have, let's say, historical link to the incarnate logos, but it can also happen in other kinds of cultures, can be approximated in all kinds of good ways by other people who get into communion with the logos. It's more of a hierarchical claim, I think, the same kind of a gap that we were talking about earlier.
It's not only on Eastern churches, right? Because I've been to the Vatican. I've seen the School of Athens at the heart of the Vatican, right? So it's also in the Catholic tradition too. I mean, I think, I mean, my point about Socrates, though, did not take away from the point that I wanted to acknowledge on behalf of both of you, the redemption of the materiality, the promise of the redemption of materiality, the promise of the redemption of history. And you guys seem to agree with me that where people are trying to take that up argumentatively is telos. But that's, of course, again, where I'm not convinced by the teleological arguments.
Well, let's dig into telos a little bit more, because I'm very interested in the ways, because I look at your project, John, and I think, I want to see, just like Mary had said on her channel, I want to see John helping, people bound by the meaning crisis be free. And I've talked to I've talked to Mark and Manuel and many people over that have worked in that Discord server. And, when Manuel talks about, he, started meditating and that helped him get rhythms in his life, I do nothing but cheer that because, amen, Mark, you get your life in order. That's what I want for you. I want, and we all want. So, oh shoot, where was I
Sorry,
going with this?
you were frozen there for a sec. What did you say, Paul? I got to the point where you talked about Mark and Manuel, and then I couldn't hear what you said.
Oh,
after that.
but when I talk to them and I see that, they're, they have been blessed by you. I'll use Christian language. They've been blessed by you and your work. I cheer that.
Yeah.
And but the question of telos is very interesting because, of course, in Christianity, it was so interesting in one of the Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris things. Sam Harris actually used this illustration, which I blew my mind that he used it, because in Christianity, to a degree, theologically, the future pulls us towards it. Not just, I think often we imagine as progressivists that we are pushed by history, which in fact we are, but telos is sort of the future pulls it towards us. But, Christians have been asking questions about this too. There's open theology where, well, how set is the future? And it's, it's funny because a lot of Christians that are really high on telos will say, I know. But then if you start asking them detailed questions, they'll say, well, we can't know. So it's like, oh, how much do you really know?
There's a great place in the Summa where
Socratic humility.
I think we were speaking double. Okay, I think I'll keep going. There's a point in the Summa where Aquinas talks about God shaping the world through both necessary causes and contingent causes. I think in the same way that I think there's a lot of confusion about the supernatural when we turn it into some sort of parallel universe, there's also a tendency to take the teleology going on within creation as the teleology that, let's say, we humans act on the world. I think the way I mean, I'll have to look more into this, but the way I tend to see it is more that the logos constrains the emergence within creation, and it will emerge closer. Oh, go ahead.
And there's movement within the philosophy of biology. My colleague Dennis Walsh here at U of T, where he's reconfigured the notion of telos, because when you talk about function, if you talk about biology, you're talking about functions. When you talk about function, you're invoking some kind of teleology because things are done on purpose, right? He has been working. I hope you can hear me because you guys.
We can hear everything. Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, great. So he has he's been restructuring, reconfiguring, reformulating. That's the word I'm looking for. The notion of teleology more and more around this idea of constraints, constraints that are conducive to an organism's survival, as opposed to causes that make it survive. Right, and this language, I think, is very important and very effective, and it's a very different picture from the forward pulling magnet that is the typical way final causation and teleology is understood. So I agree with you, JP, that I think there is movement even within the scientific community, at least within the philosophy of biology, to try and re-understand teleology as this constraints that conduce, in contrast to causes that produce, which I think is a sort of a slogan way of putting it. And then for me, that moves it out of the future magnet, and it's more about, again, the complete interpenetration of emergence and emanation. And so it would lead to something like the complete interpenetration of teleology and causation, or efficient and final. But we should maybe get rid of that language, because I think that language has contributed to the misapprehension. So
it's the same.
that's a good move you made, Paul. I mean, maybe again we can close the gap a little bit more by getting a naturalistic account of teleology that is not so antithetical to the soteriological account. That's a good point. I acknowledge that. I think that's a very good point.
I think, and this has been true over a very long time for me. I part of me asks and John, I have as much trust in you as a conversation partner as I do with just about anybody, even though we've never met physically yet, just in terms of my interactions with you. Part of me always asks the question, what are we really afraid of with respect to some of these theistic frameworks?
Mhm.
And I know that there are plenty, I mean, human beings have used this stuff to do plenty of bad, but if we dismiss things because human beings have used things for evil, we've got nothing left.
Everything goes out the window.
But
I
the
totally,
but
totally know.
I think part of what we fear is that, and I speak to this as a Calvinist because my tradition has been as scary on this as any. I think what we fear is the loss of our own freedom. And I think, John, probably one of the biggest, contributions that you have made for me in terms of my view of the world and my thought life is freedom, as is colloquially used, doesn't work very well, but your images of reciprocal narrowing and reciprocal broadening and agency I found tremendously helpful to sort of get away from some of the limitations of freedom language. And I think we fear that a a a personal yet arenic, powerful God that pulls us towards him, which is also pulling us towards our potentiality. In my view, Christianity and the miracles of Christ himself lead me to say that this process leads towards reciprocal broadening and actually the enlargement of my agency, that in fact his agency and my agency are not in competition.
Yeah. Yeah.
That and I think this is what I hear from you with your longing of my intimations of where you want to go. And I think this is true and right, that what, and Lewis says this in many different ways, God as our Father wants us to be sons who grow up into manhood. And so, I hear a lot of fear from people of that. They fear that the bigger this God gets, that we will then somehow be, our relationship with that God will reduce us to reciprocal narrowing and
Yeah.
less agency. But I've always seen it the other way around.
I agree with you. I think that is the case in a lot of anti-theism, um, um, and um, and I want to acknowledge that it's reasonable to believe that's a bias in me because of my negative experience of a version of Christianity. So I don't want to dismiss what you're saying. I would say though that I think there's other things. And the classical problems are there, and they're classical precisely because they're there, which is the problem of evil. It's hard for me to see Auschwitz as part of the redemption of history.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, if that's the only way you can redeem history, wow. Like, and I'm not saying that I have the right to judge God or anything, but if we're going to offer history as evidence, we have to consider history as evidence. We can't play according to a double standard, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
And so it's Auschwitz. It's the fact that I see 99.99% of the universe just smashing into entropy and not showing any of this movement. Those are the things that I think are also at work. I acknowledge the first point, and I acknowledge that it's probably vectored into me because of my personal upbringing. I'm not dismissing it, but I'm saying I think there's other issues that are also part of why there's a challenge. I do think it's I think there's also a fourth thing, which is just the cogency of arguments and theories, which I think we should also not dismiss.
Yeah.
I think science has progressed the way it has, not just because of happenstance. It's progressed because it's unveiling something about the nature of reality that we have to take into consideration. I don't want to have the last word, but I've got to go soon, gentlemen. But I would like to propose we have another discussion. That way we'd have a full-blown trilogy around that final point. Because to me now a lot of gaps were, I think, really wonderfully shrunk here. And I thank you genuinely, both of you, for doing that. But I think where we come, this telos, redemption of history, redemption of materiality, and the sort of 4 points that you were all nodding, so you weren't denying the plausibility of them being also the case, that we bring this, we have a discussion around that. And I'm not asking you guys to solve the problem of evil. That would be a ridiculously unfair thing to do. But maybe what I'm asking for is, what's the connection between the argument that you've made here, and that I think I've shown you I genuinely respect it, and these classical problems? I mean, there's some at least explanation that I think would be very valuable to hear, valuable for me, and perhaps valuable for your respective listeners as well.
Yeah,
that would be terrific.
Great. Yeah,
maybe
that was really
can
great.
Write another excellent paper.
I'll try to. I'll do my best. Yeah. Yeah, this was really fun and really insightful. John, you brought out my point better than I had, so that's always impressive when you do that, and very useful to me.
He does that often.
because I mean, and maybe this is apropos of everything we've said, I'm learning and learning again and learning again and again Socrates' point of following the logos of the argument, and be really willing to follow it. And especially with companions who are also willing to do that too. So that's I want to give credit to him for that. So gentlemen, let's try and set up the third Dialogos. I think we were genuinely doing Dialogos here. And thank you so much. I was looking forward to this all day, and it exceeded my expectations. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Take care.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.